Okay, picking back up at term 53. In his groundwork for the metaphysics of morals, Immanuel Kant is trying to find an a priori foundation for ethics. That's down in term 56. Now, the trick here is that Kant is writing after Descartes and after Hume, and he wants to have a foundation for ethics even if Hume is right. And he thinks he's found that with term 55, the categorical imperative. So the idea here is that Kant needs to find a basics for moral action that precedes rational thought. And so in order to get there, I do want to briefly mention term 54. This is Kant's idea of transcendental idealism, where Kant divides reality into two different realms. There is the world of thought and the world of materiality. Now, the trick here is that Kant calls the world of thought, of course, the noumenal, and the world of reality, the phenomenal. But the phenomenal is what we can know with certainty. The noumenal is unsure. This is very similar to Plato's division between the world of ideas and the world of material things, except that Kant doesn't connect these two. Kant doesn't think that we have this whole transmigration of the soul linking the two realities. Now, with that, let's get into what we actually spend a lot of time in, and that is the idea of the categorical imperative. Because here is Kant's assertion that even if Hume is right, the categorical imperative, it becomes the way to do ethical reasoning. And the principle is relatively simple. Every time we're faced with an ethical dilemma, we ought to then think about, okay, what would happen if everyone did this? If everyone made this choice, well, then that should tell me whether or not I should make this choice. And it might go something like this. If I was thinking about one of my colleagues who had left a much nicer car than mine, running with the keys in it, and I was like, oh, should I take Mr. Hartzell's Mustang out for a joyride? Well, let's stop and think about that. What would happen if everyone on the planet took other people's property when they felt like it and had the ability to do that? Well, if everyone did that, that would really destroy property rights, and that would destroy civilization as we know it. I don't want to destroy civilization as we know it, so I should not take Mr. Hartzell's car out for a joyride. And that really becomes Kant's suggestion as to how do we handle ethical reasoning. Now, Kant words that principle in multiple ways. The only other one that I want to cover briefly is in term 57 and 58, the Kantian kingdom of ends versus the kingdom of means. By the end of the groundwork, Kant is referring to human beings in these two ways. And Kant argues that really human beings are these amazing creatures. We are each an ultimate end unto ourselves. We are each, and we each have to treat each other in every action as if that person is an end. Where Aquinas was talking about happiness and the love of God being the ultimate end, Kant says actually your neighbor is an end unto himself. And with that idea, Kant then reaches for a metaphor of a kingdom, and he says, we all live in a kingdom, and we are either operating towards the other members of a kingdom in one of two ways. When we are treating people as ends, we are acting as legislators in the kingdom of ends, and with our actions, we are proclaiming laws in which the other people are treated as supremely valuable ends unto themselves. But if we are acting where other people are treated as means to some end of what we want, then we are legislating through our actions in the kingdom of means. We are all in this kingdom, and through our actions we are proclaiming what laws we believe to be universally applicable in this particular context. So the Kantian kingdom of ends is really where Kant believes we should be, but he thinks we actually more often live in the kingdom of means. But in each case, we are legislating through our actions what we really believe in terms of ethics. So there is a very brief review of Immanuel Kant. We are going to shift northward and forward in time with our next philosopher to Danish author and wannabe literati, Søren Kierkegaard. I hope you guys enjoyed Kierkegaard. He was definitely my favorite new philosopher this year. I had never read him, and I am making no claim to authoritatively interpret Kierkegaard, but here is my understanding of how all these pieces fit together. So we're going to pick up with term 59, Kierkegaard's aesthetic life. Kierkegaard's Kierkegaard's aesthetic life and the ethical life are one of the many contrasts in his book Either Or. In the book Either Or, Kierkegaard is trying to get us to make a real choice. So he keeps presenting us with exclusive options. We will either live the aesthetic life or we will live the ethical life. The aesthetic life is closely tied to term 62, the aesthete, and term 65, romantic love. And I'm going to explain all three of those together, and then I'm going to hit the ethical life, the judge, and marital love. And then we'll talk about how a couple other pieces about these guys. So, the aesthetic life is supposedly one seeking beauty, and it's seeking beauty in the moment of extreme pleasure. This is what is articulated by the aesthete as being the ultimate goal. You want to have the highest pleasure that is rare and extreme and uncommon to other people. And the way you do that is through the pursuit of romantic love. That becomes kind of the way the aesthete symbolizes his goal and what he's arguing for. Now, this romantic love, with the Greek word eros, this is really kind of the idea of a string of one-night stands with increasingly beautiful women and increasingly exciting experiences. But each time the night is over, day is done, and there is no relationship, this guy just moves on. His whole idea of aesthetic love is encapsulated through the metaphor of seduction. It's have the moment and move on. There's no lasting nature to the aesthete's lifestyle. Now, the aesthete argues that this actually is the most beautiful life, and that one who is moving through all of these experiences has the greatest ability to measure whether or not his life is truly good. And that's in direct contrast, of course, to the judge, where the judge argues for a different kind of life. The judge writes back to the aesthete and tries to kind of bring some aged wisdom to the aesthete. He argues instead of that seeking the aesthetic life, we ought to be pursuing something more in line with the ethical life. Where the ethical life for Kierkegaard is not about keeping a list of do's and avoiding a list of don'ts. Instead, it's about forming the self into the person that you want to be. It's really about self-formation through choices. And we'll come back to that with some of these other terms. But so the judge is the one who is articulating this desire for the ethical life, and his symbol of that is marital love, with the idea of agape, where instead of a momentary fling or a short-term passionate affair, the judge says, no, what is truly beautiful, the truly beautiful life, is the life that is well lived over the long haul. I put this in one of the passages in the passage section, where the judge says that you don't want an ideal husband who is ideal for one day. Instead, you want an ideal husband who is ideal every day. I explained this in class with the idea of taking out the trash. Girls, you don't want to marry a guy who tells you he will take out the trash day one of the marriage and never again. You want to marry somebody who will take out the trash every day. That's really the idea that the judge is articulating. And the judge makes the argument that this marital love is where real beauty is to be found. This kind of beauty is not nearly as poetic, it's not nearly as exciting, it's not nearly as passionate, but it is far better than what the aesthete is arguing for. Okay, now let's jump back and pick up two terms we've skipped over, term 61 and 64. Taste, in term 61, in the aesthetic sense, is referring to the idea that there are ways to determine whether things are better than other things in their category, and people who have more cultivated taste are better equipped to determine that. One of the easiest ways to see this is in terms of wine, which I realize does not really work for you guys since none of y'all are legally allowed to drink wine yet, but bear with me on the example, that there are ways to tell whether a wine is a cheap or an expensive wine, and the wine taster who has a well-trained palate can sense more of the complexities in a good wine than other people who are less well-trained. He is said to have good taste. Now, the same thing happens, maybe a bit more easy for us all to see, happens with movies. where we can see that maybe one movie is aesthetically better than another movie. Think of some good examples. Maybe we would say that the old movie Casablanca is truly a great movie, and it encapsulated its moment perfectly. Whereas the new Star Wars movie, The Force Awakens, is less than a great movie. Maybe a fine movie, but not a great movie. Not one that lasts throughout time. Those are judgments of taste. And if we were truly going to embrace the idea of aesthetics, we would need to figure out what are the objective criteria that are being expressed in terms of taste. Because taste is not just one person's feeling about something. It's the judgment that one thing is better or worse than it should be. And in doing that, we need to know what the taster is using to judge that. Okay, now take a look at term 64, because this is a really critical one. Because Kierkegaard has a bit where he does talk about different kinds of history. He talks about inner history and outer history. Outer history is the predominant kind of history that we know of, where it's wars and rumors of wars and famines and political events and all kinds of stuff. Inner history is the development of the inner person. And it's the history of the individual person and the making of choices that forms him into who he is becoming. And for Kierkegaard, this inner history is the important history. So, okay, moving on then. Term 67, by the end of either or, the judge makes his argument that really he's not saying that there's not a beauty. He just has a different principle of beauty. For the judge, a thing is more beautiful in as much as it lasts over time, and it deals with extension over time and space rather than just this brief momentary existence. So for the judge, a marriage of 50 years is going to be a far more beautiful thing than is a romance that begins, climaxes, and flames out within 4 days. Okay, now take a look at term 68, the moment of existential choice. This is Kierkegaard's idea that there are moments where really all of a sudden it's as if each individual comes to a fork in the road. Now there are lots of minor decisions we make throughout each day. Should I wear a green shirt or a blue shirt? Should I wear shoes or flip-flops? Should I drive to school the quick way or the slow way? All kinds of minor choices, but occasionally we reach significant choices. Should I marry this person? Should I take this job or that job? Should I abandon everything and follow my dream? All kinds of real choices. These moments of existential choice, which have to do with the way in which we live and how we go forward in our existence, have everything to do with forming the soul. And that really becomes the answer to question 69. The soul forms itself through choices through these existential choices. So it becomes a question, the gang leader tells you, shoot this guy and we'll let you in. Well, you shoot him, you are forming yourself into a murderer. If you do not, you are forming yourself into a more virtuous person. And so on. Okay. So, take a look then at term 70. Now we're shifting at term 70 to a different book. Here we're looking at Kierkegaard's book, Fear and Trembling. And this is where Kierkegaard showed us a very different perspective and different kind of philosophy. Where here Kierkegaard is trying to articulate in the middle of the 19th century, what is faith and why do so few people have it, but why does that faith matter? And he talked about several people, and we're going to start with the Knight of Faith. The Knight of Faith is the man who successfully acts in accordance with his faith, even when absurd things are demanded of him. And Kierkegaard's example of this is Abraham, where Abraham takes his son Isaac, his only son Isaac, whom he loves, and is willing to kill his son there on Mount Moriah, because God told him to. Now this Knight of Faith is the one who exemplifies the idea of Kierkegaard's idea. And he's arguing here that Abraham acts in faith here in a fascinating way. Now that knight of faith is different from term 71, the knight of resignation. The knight of resignation in Kierkegaard's thought is the one who has kind of simply just resigned himself that he's not in control. He is not going to be able to do a whole lot, and he's just going to roll with it, and that's okay. But the knight of faith has an intentionality that is enabled by his faith. The knight of resignation is where Kierkegaard places himself. He looks around the world and he can't control the actions of the world, but he's just resigned to that. He's resigned to the fact that the girl he loves will never love him back, and so on. But this Kierkegaardian faith in term 72 is a fascinating concept, and it really has everything to do with term 73, which is the absurd. So I think the idea of his faith, Kierkegaardian faith, will make more sense if we talk about the absurd. Now, Kierkegaard is not talking about clinical insanity here. Instead, he's talking about things that are beyond scientific proof. And that really the knight of faith is the one who has faith in what is beyond our ability to know for sure. So to really understand this, let's go back to Abraham and Isaac there on Mount Moriah. Abraham is standing there. He is poised with the knife. He plunges the knife downward. He is about to kill his only son. At which point the angel says, "Stop!" Well, if we jump forward in the biblical tradition to the New Testament letter to the Hebrews, the author of Hebrews gives us some insight into what Abraham thought in that moment. Abraham believed that God would keep his word. So if God will keep his word, and God has promised that Isaac will be the father of the next generation, but God tells Abraham to kill his son, Abraham has complete faith that God will raise Isaac from the dead. Which this is what Kierkegaard then points to as saying, like, look, that is absurd. That is the absurd. It is the absurd to say that there is an all-powerful God who will defy nature and raise the dead. But Abraham acts because of his faith in the absurd. Because he believes these things, Abraham then is confident that they will happen, even if it makes no normal logical sense. So this Kierkegaardian kind of faith is an extreme faith that really only works if the absurd is real and does what the knight of faith believes it will do. So Abraham is the guy that Kierkegaard keeps coming back to say, look at what Abraham did. Now, term 74 is right where we ended in our reading of Kierkegaard. And I want to remind you of really how Kierkegaard reasons his way through this. Because Abraham also sets up an ethical dilemma. And the solution to the ethical dilemma is the phrase in term 74, the teleological suspension of the ethical. This teleological suspension of the ethical is the idea that normally we reason through ethics in a certain way. Is it right? Is it wrong? And so on. But in some few cases, a higher authority than the human can, for the accomplishment of a greater purpose, can suspend the ethical. And that's what's going on here in this ethical test. Now, of course, normally it is immoral, it is unethical for a father to kill his own son. That should be pretty self-evident. But in this moment, God is seeking to prove Abraham's faith. It is a test of faith. So God is far beyond humanity and creation. And so because of that, God can can suspend the ethical and enable Abraham to then test his faith and then move on from there. Now, I think we see the exact same thing happening in the Passion narratives. Because if you haven't run into this argument, I'm confident all of you will at some point, where it's a very common atheistic argument against the existence of God to say that God is good. Well, killing a son is wrong, is immoral. So God killed Jesus on the cross, and therefore either God is not good, in which case we shouldn't follow him, or God doesn't exist. Well, this then gives a way of understanding what's happening there, is that God is suspending the normal ethical reality for the accomplishment of a higher purpose, where God suspends the ethical for the redemption of mankind. So this is not our typical ethical reality, but this is a higher ethical reality where the normal ethics are suspended for this high purpose. Now, please do note, this only works if you have a higher being, God, who can suspend normal ethics because he created and defines ethics. You and I do not have the ability to teleologically suspend the ethical. Kierkegaard is not giving us a way out of ethical demands. He is not telling us how we can do that. Okay, that finishes Kierkegaard, and I'm going to pause this as a second video, and we're going to pick up in just a moment with our last two guys. We've got to do Nietzsche, and we've got to do Lewis. But before that, my wife wants to show you our cat. My wife's not going to, well, no, there goes the cat. And Kaylee, you're going to be a YouTube star. She does not care. She teleologically suspends the ethical caring about YouTube.